There's this guy in Phoenix, 67 years old, retires with $600,000. His advisor tells him he can spend 4% a year adjusted for inflation, and he'll be fine. 20 years later, he's sitting on $1.4 million. Another couple in Tampa. Same story, $630,000 at retirement. 30 years later, they're dead and their kids inherit $2.1 million. A woman in Denver, $550,000 when she retired, 89 years old now, still alive, portfolios at $1.8 million. This isn't cherry picking. This is what actually happens to most retirees. And nobody talks about it because the entire financial industry is built on making you terrified that you don't have enough. Here's what I'm going to show you. The 4% rule. The thing every financial advisor on earth will tell you is conservative and safe isn't just conservative. It's so conservative that it basically guarantees you'll die rich. And I mean really rich. We're talking about doubling or tripling your starting balance while you're also spending from it for 30 years. The math on this is so absurd that when I started digging into the actual data, not the marketing brochures, I realized the entire retirement industry has a really uncomfortable problem. They've created a safety margin so wide that it's not a safety margin anymore. It's a wealth accumulation vehicle disguised as a spending plan. Let me start with a story. Back in the 90s, there was this financial planner named William Ben. Really smart guy. He wanted to figure out the safest amount a retiree could spend each year without running out of money. So, he did what any data nerd would do. He looked at every single 30-year period going back to 1871. Every combination of stock and bond returns, every recession, every boom, every crash, the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 70s, all of it. And he asked one question: what's the maximum percentage you could have withdrawn, adjusted for inflation every year, and still not run out of money in the worst-case scenario? The answer was 4-something%, but he rounded down to 4 to be extra safe, and that became the 4% rule. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Benin designed this rule to survive the absolute worst 30-year period in modern financial history. I'm talking about retiring in January of 1966, right before a brutal bear market, right before stagflation, right before everything went sideways for over a decade. If you retired then with a standard 60-40 portfolio and followed the 4% rule, you'd run out of money right at the end of 30 years. Barely made it. That's the nightmare scenario the entire rule is built around. One 30-year period out of over 100 rolling periods he tested. Think about that design choice for a second. Benin built a rule that works in 99.99% of scenarios. But you might be thinking, okay, that's good, right? We want safety, sure, except here's the thing. When you design a system to handle the worst-case scenario, you're not optimizing for the average case. You're not even optimizing for the pretty bad case. You're optimizing for a statistical catastrophe. It's like if I told you to pack for a trip to Florida, but I made you bring a parka because there's a 0.01% chance of a freak blizzard. Let me give you the central metaphor I want you to hold on to. The 4% rule is like an airbag designed by someone who's terrified of lawsuits. A normal airbag deploys at exactly the force needed to save your life in a crash. But imagine if engineers got so scared of that one in a million scenario where the airbag wasn't enough that they tripled the deployment force. Sure, you'd survive every crash, but you'd also break your nose and crack your ribs every single time. The cure becomes worse than the disease. That's what's happening with the 4% rule. It's so overbuilt for catastrophe that it creates a different problem. You're dying with millions you could have spent. Now, the first layer of this, the math itself, is deliberately pessimistic in ways most people don't understand. When Ben ran his numbers, he used historical returns, but he also assumed you'd rebalance annually, which cost money. He assumed you'd have some allocation to bonds, which dragged down returns. He assumed you'd adjust your spending every single year for inflation like clockwork, even though real retirees don't do that. And here's the big one. He assumed you die exactly at the 30-year mark. Not 29 years, not 31, exactly 30. So if you retire at 67, the rule assumes you'll live to 97. And not just live, still be spending the same amount adjusted for inflation at 96 as you were at 67. If your health fails and you spend less in your 80s and 90s, which is what actually happens, the math breaks even further in your favor. There's this study from BlackRock Center, the world's largest money manager. They looked at real accounts, actual retirees, not simulations, not theory, real people. After 17 to 18 years of retirement, About 40% of retirees had 100% or more of their starting balance. Let me say that again. After nearly 2 decades of withdrawals, 4 out of 10 people had lost no wealth. Another 8 to 10% had between 80 and 100% left. So half of all retirees are barely touching their principal after almost 20 years. They're living off growth and dividends, and their money is just sitting there compounding. Here's the kicker. The 4% rule was stress-tested against 115 rolling 30-year periods going back to 1870. You know how many times someone following that rule would have ended up with less than they started with? 12. 12 times out of 115. That's a 10% failure rate. And even in those 12 scenarios, they didn't go to zero. They just had less than the starting amount. Meanwhile, in the other 103 scenarios, retirees ended up with more, often way more. On average, if you followed the 4% rule, your withdrawal rate could have been over 6%, and you still would have been fine. Second layer, behavior changes everything, and this is where the psychology gets really interesting. Financial advisors won't tell you this, because their entire business model depends on you being scared. But real retirees don't spend like robots. They adapt. Let me tell you about a couple I knew when I was still advising. Call them Steve and Linda. They retired with $700,000. First year, they spent exactly 4%, $28,000 plus Social Security. They were pulling in about $70,000 total. Year 2, the market dropped 15%. Their portfolio went from $700,000 to around $600,000 after their withdrawal. You know what they did? They didn't withdraw $28,000 adjusted for inflation, like the rule says. They looked at their balance, got a little nervous, and cut back. They spent $24,000 that year instead, took one less vacation, ate out a little less. Not poverty, just normal human adjustment. Then year 3 and 4, the market ripped. Their balance went back up. And you know what? They didn't increase their spending to make up for it. They just stayed at that slightly lower level because they had already adjusted their lifestyle. Fast forward 20 years. They're in their late 80s. Steve has some health issues. They're not traveling anymore. Their spending is way down, maybe $20,000 a year now. And their portfolio, even with all those withdrawals, is sitting at $1.6 million. They accidentally got rich again. This is what actually happens. The 4% rule assumes you're a spending machine, that you'll increase your withdrawals by inflation every single year, no matter what. But humans don't work that way. When your portfolio drops, you feel it. You pull back. When your health declines, you spend less because you can't do the things that cost money anymore. The rule doesn't account for any of this psychological reality. Third layer, let's talk about sequence of returns risk, because this is the boogeyman that keeps financial advisors employed. The idea is simple. If you retire right before a crash and you're withdrawing money while the market is down, you're selling shares at low prices and you can't recover. You run out of money faster. This is true. It's real. But here's what nobody tells you. The window of danger is way smaller than you think. There's this concept called the critical period. It's roughly the first 10 years of retirement. If you can survive that decade without a catastrophic market crash, or more importantly, if you can survive a crash in that decade by cutting spending temporarily, you're basically fine. After 10 years, you've taken out enough money that your portfolio is smaller, which means sequence risk matters less. But here's the thing. The 4% rule already accounts for the worst sequence risk in history. Remember 1966? That's baked in. The rule is designed around that exact nightmare. Every other sequence is less bad. And here's what's wild. Even in that worst case, if you retired in January of 1966 and followed the 4% rule, you didn't run out until year 30. But what if you'd been willing to cut your spending by 10% in year 2 or 3 when you saw the market tanking? You would have been fine, more than fine. You would have recovered and still ended up with money left over. The 4% rule doesn't give you credit for having a functioning brain. Now, let me tell you the real kicker. And this is where I kind of lost my mind when I first saw this data. Michael Kitces, who's one of the actual thought leaders in retirement planning, not some YouTube guru, ran the numbers on what happens when you follow the 4% rule. He found that over 2/3 of the time, retirees finish with more than double their wealth. After spending 4% every year for 30 years, adjusting for inflation, 2/3 of people still doubled their money. Half the time wealth nearly triples. Half. You retire with $600,000 following the quote-unquote safe rule. And 50% of the time you're going to die with $1.8 million or more. This is insane. This isn't a retirement spending strategy. This is a dynasty wealth plan with withdrawals. And nobody talks about it because the financial industry makes money two ways. They make money managing your assets while you're working, and they make money managing your assets while you're retired. If they told you that you could spend 6% instead of 4%, your portfolio would be smaller. Smaller portfolio means smaller fees, so they don't fourth layer. And this is where we need to get granular with a real scenario. Let's say you're 67, you've got $600,000. Your Social Security is $4,000 a month for you and your spouse combined. That's $48,000 a year, pretty average for a married couple. You want to spend $75,000 a year total. That means you need to pull $27,000 from your portfolio. That's a 4.5% withdrawal rate, higher than the sacred 4%. Every financial advisor would tell you that's risky. You're not being conservative. You need to spend less. But let's run the actual math. You've got a 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Historically, that's returned around 7 to 8% annually after inflation. Some years more, some years less, but that's the average. If you withdraw 4.5% and your portfolio grows at 7%, you're net positive 2.5% every year. Your portfolio grows even while you're taking money out. Over 30 years, compounding at 2.5% while also withdrawing, you'd still end up with more than you started with. In most scenarios, not all, but most. And here's the thing, nobody factors in. You're not going to spend $75,000 a year when you're 92. You're going to spend 50, maybe 40. You won't be traveling. You won't be going out. You might be in assisted living, which is expensive, sure, but probably covered by selling your house or long-term care insurance if you planned ahead. Point is, your spending drops. The 4.5% in year 1 becomes 3% in year 20. And by year 25, even if your portfolio stayed flat, which it won't, you're barely touching it. Let me give you a real scenario. Guy I used to know, not a client, just someone in my network, retired in 2009. Terrible timing, right? Market crashed. Portfolio went from $800,000 to about $550,000 in the span of 6 months. He was planning to withdraw 4%, which would have been $32,000 from the original $800, but now his portfolio was $550. He freaked out, didn't touch it that first year, lived entirely on Social Security and a small pension, $46,000 total. Tight, but doable. Year 2, market recovered a bit. He pulled $25,000. Year 3, $28,000. By year 5, his portfolio was back over $800,000 because he'd barely withdrawn during the recovery. He kept his withdrawals conservative, averaged about $35,000 a year. Fast forward to today, 17 years later, he's 84. Portfolio is at $1.7 million. He's spending maybe $30,000 a year now because he doesn't do much anymore. He survived the worst market crash since the Great Depression in his first year of retirement and still nearly doubled his money. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what about someone who retired in 1999 and had to live through the dot crash and then the 28 financial crisis? 2 major crashes in the first decade. That's the nightmare. Here's the data. Someone who retired in December of 99 with a 60-40 portfolio, followed the 4% rule, would have still had 93% of their original balance after 30 years. Not doubled, not tripled, but they didn't run out. They survived 2 generational crashes in the first 10 years and still died with nearly all their money. And that's assuming they spent 4% like a robot. If they cut back at all during those crashes, they would have had way more. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The 4% rule isn't designed to fund your retirement. It's designed to protect financial advisors from lawsuits and make sure you die with a huge inheritance for your kids. William Ben himself recently came out with a book where he basically admits this. He says the 4% rule is based on 99.99% certainty. There's not many things in life where we demand that level of certainty. I don't wear a helmet to walk down the street, even though there's a non-zero chance a piano falls on my head. But we've applied this insane standard to retirement spending. Bangan shows that if you're comfortable with an 80% success rate, which by the way is still really conservative, your safe withdrawal rate jumps to somewhere between 5.75 and 6%. 6%. That's 50% more than 4. 50%. You could retire years earlier or spend significantly more during retirement and still be fine 80% of the time. And in the 20% of scenarios where you're not fine, you're not going to zero. You're just going to have less than you started with, which means you cut back a bit. You adapt like a human. Let me hit you with one more story to make this concrete. There's this concept in retirement planning called dynamic spending. It's the opposite of the 4% rule. Instead of spending a fixed percentage adjusted for inflation, you spend based on your portfolio's current value. If your portfolio is up, you spend more. If it's down, you spend less. There was a guy, early client of mine, who retired with $900,000. First year, spent 5%, $45,000. Market was good that year. Portfolio went to $975,000. Year 2, he spent 5% of $975, $48,000. Year 3, market dropped. Portfolio went to $850 after his withdrawal. He spent 5% of $850, $42,000. Had to tighten the belt a little. But here's what happened. Over 20 years, his average spending was $47,000 a year, higher than the 4% rule would have given him from $900,000. And his portfolio balance at year 20 was $1.1 million. He spent more and ended with more because he was flexible. This is the part where I need to hit you with the really dark truth. Social Security is actually an incredibly strong safety net. The average married couple right now gets about $48,000 a year in benefits. That's up from around $34,000 in 2000 adjusted for inflation. That's above the poverty line for elderly couples by more than double, which means even if you completely screw up your portfolio withdrawals and somehow burn through all your money, which is almost statistically impossible with the 4% rule, you're not eating cat food. You're living a modest but stable life on Social Security. The absolute floor is way higher than people think. So why doesn't anyone tell you this? 2 reasons. First, fear sells. Every financial institution makes money by convincing you that retirement is precarious and dangerous, and you need them to navigate it. If they told you the truth, which is that most people are oversaving and underspending, you might not pay them 1% of your assets every year to manage it. Second, and this is more insidious, the financial advice industry optimizes for the advisor's risk, not yours. An advisor who tells a client they can spend 6% and then the market crashes in year 2, that advisor gets sued. That advisor loses their license. Even if the math works out over 30 years, the advisor can't take that career risk. So, they tell everyone 4% cover their own ass, and you die with $2 million you could have spent on enjoying your life. Let me give you 2 quick comedic interludes here because this is getting heavy. First, imagine you're the heir to one of these estates. Your dad retires with $600,000, lives a modest life, never travels, always worried about money, dies at 92 with $2.3 million. You inherit it. First thought, thanks, Dad. Second thought, why didn't you just go to Italy? The whole system is set up to create this exact outcome. Wealthy heirs and regretful retirees. Second scenario, imagine being William Ben. You create the 4% rule, it becomes gospel. Every financial advisor in America uses it. Then 30 years later, you publish a book that's basically like, hey, you guys know that was for the worst case scenario ever, right? You don't actually have to follow it that strictly. And everyone just ignores you and keeps preaching 4% because it's easier to sell certainty than nuance. That's got to be a weird feeling. Like inventing the airbag and then watching everyone use it as a pillow. Now, let me bring this back to the hook. Why do retirees with $600,000 end up with $2 million? 3 reasons, and these are the practical takeaways. First, the 4% rule is engineered for 1 in a 100 worst-case scenario. Following it in the other 99 scenarios is like wearing a winter coat in summer. It works, but you're uncomfortable for no reason. If you're willing to accept an 80 or even 90% success rate instead of 99.99%, you can spend significantly more. Run your own numbers. Use a Monte Carlo simulator. Be honest about your flexibility. If the market drops 30% in year 2, can you cut your spending by 10% for a couple years? If yes, you can probably start at 5 or even 5.5%. Maybe higher if you've got other income sources. Second, real human behavior saves you. The 4% rule assumes you're a robot who increases spending by inflation every year and never adapts to market conditions or life circumstances. That's nonsense. When your portfolio drops, you'll naturally pull back. When you hit your 80s, you'll spend less because you physically can't do expensive things anymore. This behavioral flexibility is worth at least half a percentage point in withdrawal rate, maybe more, but no calculator accounts for it because you can't model common sense. Third, Social Security is a floor that's way higher than people think. If everything goes wrong, if you live to 105 and the market crashes 3 times and you somehow burn through your entire portfolio, you've still got Social Security. For a married couple, that's close to $50,000 a year. It's not luxury, but it's also not poverty. The real risk people are terrified of dying broke, and homeless is almost impossible if you've worked long enough to get a decent Social Security benefit. This means you can take more risk with your portfolio because the downside is capped. Here's my final take. The retirement industry has sold us a story about scarcity and danger that's mostly fiction. The math shows that if you follow the standard advice, you're going to die rich, really rich, which is fine if that's your goal. If you want to leave a big inheritance, great. Follow the 4% rule. But if you actually want to enjoy your retirement, travel, spend time with people you love, do things while you're still healthy enough to do them, the data says you can probably spend more, maybe a lot more. I've got multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in markets. I've read the actual studies, not the blog post summarizing the studies. I've talked to hundreds of retirees about what actually happened versus what they planned. And here's what I believe. What 99% of people do is usually what not to do. 99% of people are following the 4% rule, terrified of running out of money, dying with estates they never enjoyed. Do the math yourself. Stress test your own scenario. Be honest about your flexibility. And maybe, just maybe, take that trip to Italy.